Okay, great. Here we are. Welcome. Good evening. Happy Wednesday. It's September. Here we are, 2022. Looking forward to what the rest of the season and the new year brings, right, everybody? So we have a pretty exciting class for you tonight. I'm excited about it. I know that I oftentimes always say things like I study a region or I drink wine from it, and then I get really excited and I say we should all go. But really, we should all go to the Côte Chalonnaise. You saw that in my email earlier, but do you like to drink wines with terroir expression? Do you like to drink wine from producers with a collective knowledge spanning generations, decades, and sometimes centuries of specific plots of land? And do you like to drink high-end wine for less money, especially Burgundy? Yes, we do. So we're going to drink the Côte Chalonnaise. I think a lot of time people find it a little bit difficult to understand, and it is. There is a reason for that. There are no Grand Crus like we see in the Côte d'Or, and we're really talking about a pretty large collection of Premier Crus that maybe don't necessarily always merit their own separate Premier Cru status. So we really have quite a bit of things to talk about. Let's just go for it. Right, let's get started. So I'm not going to go through every single slide verbatim with you. Oftentimes, we like to say that we prepare these slideshows with a lot of dense information, but a lot of that is so that you have that information on your own. And especially for somewhere where we're trying to grasp the concept of a region and understand either the lay of the land, including the different vineyards, the villages, the Premier Cru area, the village Liudi, and also the producers who are making wine from these plots of land. It helps to have a base and a foundation, and that's really what we're doing today. But we put together these slides so that you have a reference to go back to. These are not things that I came up with and put in these slides myself. These are not things that the primary reference that I used for this, which is the Jasper Morris book, Inside Burgundy, which I always extol the virtues of. It's a great, great book. You can see how intense it is here. But I do collect them for you. I mean, it wasn't even Jasper Morris who came up with these things, right? Like literally, we're in Burgundy, and nothing is arbitrary, as we always say when it comes to the lay of the land. Every parcel has a point and a reputation. So we'll certainly talk about those and those producers as well. So where are we? We're in Burgundy. We're in France. You can see many of the main wine growing regions that we do have here. Burgundy is located in kind of mid-eastern France. It's a more continental climate. You have Chablis up in the north. You have the Côte d'Or, which is considered to be the finest expression of Burgundian wines. You have at the very bottom, you have Beaujolais for red wine from Gamay. We have the Mâconnais, which Ryan's going to be talking about next week or the week after. And then this teeny tiny little collection of non-contiguous dots is where we're going today, to the Côte Chalonnaise. Let's take a little bit of a closer look. So this is collectively the 5 main villages of the Côte Chalonnaise and their respective village and village level Liudi and the Premier Cru vineyard. And please, if anybody has a question during the discussion of the class about any of these terms, you know, we say things like in Burgundy, especially Liudi, Premier Cru, Grand Cru, Clos. If you have questions about any of these terms, please just let us know, pop it into the chat box. I bet that even some of your friends on the call would be able to answer those questions for you if you do have them. So here's a collection of the villages of the Côte Chalonnaise and the vineyards from north to south. North would be on what looked to be my right hand side looking at the screen, and south is my left hand side looking at the screen, as I'm sure it is for you as well. So starting in the north with Bouzeron, and let's just give a little context while we're looking at the map, right? I think that always helps. So first, we are going to discover what each of the villages is primarily known for in terms of its production. And then we're going to take a closer look at the villages and their individual producers, and also the the vineyard that are within them. I think today I really want to focus on producer and getting to know who we really should be looking for in this region. There are kind of like more or less 10 main producers who are really, I think, building the foundation and reinvigorating the reputation for the Côte Chalonnaise. We'll discuss more than those 10 producers, but one of the reasons that these producers are sort of driving this invigoration is not only because of how passionate they are, but also because they're big enough to make an impact. And I think that's important. So I always say, you hear me say this all the time, there are as many Burgundian styles as there are Burgundian producers, right? And oftentimes we sort of herald, especially in the kind of like New York sommelier community, we always talk about the small, the rare, the artisanal, the people that are making 9 different Grand Crus and tiny proportions of each wine. Well, those aren't the wines that drive interest to a new region. It's really these larger producers that are affordable, are accessible, but are still making really high quality wine. So we'll talk about those. We'll talk about the villages of Bouzeron. Bouzeron is a white wine village for the Aligoté grape. It is the only village appellation for Aligoté located in all of Burgundy, not just in the Côte Chalonnaise. There's a regional Burgundy Aligoté appellation, which is Bourgogne Aligoté. Producers within the Côte Chalonnaise, if they're not located in Bouzeron, or if they're not making the wine from grapes coming from Bouzeron, may use the Bourgogne Aligoté appellation on those wines. So Bouzeron, there are no Premier Crus in Bouzeron. There are only Village Liudi. We'll talk about those, as well as the most important producer, which is Aubert and Pamela Villain from Domaine Villain. You might recognize the name as being the co-director of Domaine de la Romanie Conti, one of the most important wineries in the world and one of the most important in Burgundy, located in Rhone, Romany. We'll talk about Rouy. Rouy is a village that produces sparkling white, rosé, and red wine, but they're particularly well known for their white and their sparkling wine. So Bouzeron, white, Aligoté only. Rouy, white wines and sparkling wines. The white wines here are based on Chardonnay. If you're not in Bouzeron, it's going to be Chardonnay, right? There are other plots of Aligoté in the Côte Chalonnaise, but they would be released simply as, again, Bourgogne Aligoté, right? Not Bouzeron, not Côte Chalonnaise. Côte Chalonnaise Blanc is based on Chardonnay, and the white wines of Rouy, Mercurey, Givry, and Montagny are all based on Chardonnay. So keep that in mind. Aligoté, Chardonnay, 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 Chardonnay. On the far south side, the village of Montagny is a white wine only village as well. So you can kind of think of the Côte Chalonnaise as being bookended by these white wine villages, right? Bouzeron, Aligoté, Montagny for Chardonnay. And then you have also Mercurey and Givry, which make both white and red wine, but are more well known for the quality of their red wine. So think about it like that. Bouzeron, white from Aligoté. Montagny, white from Chardonnay. Rouy, white from Chardonnay, and sparkling wine are the most dominant, but we do see red from Pinot Noir. Mercurey and Givry, primarily red from Pinot Noir, but also some white from Chardonnay in those places as well. Zooming in a little bit closer, you can see how small really the Côte Chalonnaise is, even by comparison to the Côte d'Or, but especially by comparison to even Chablis, the Mâconnais or Beaujolais. These are the 5 main villages that we'll be discussing. So these villages all have their own individual AOP and appellation that the village can release wines under. So Bouzeron, Rouy, Mercurey, Givry, and Montagny. Why do we say these names over and over? For practice. It helps us to work on these pronunciations and then also to understand what's going on in the villages, right? If you say it out loud 5 times, you're probably more likely to remember it than if you just look over the list or you read it once. Bouzeron, Rouy, Mercurey, Givry, and Montagny, the 5 villages of the Côte Chalonnaise. All right, I hope we're having fun. So the Côte Chalonnaise begins essentially where the Côte d'Or ends. It is a 25-kilometer corridor. It's more of a series of irregular hills. So it is just slightly further east than the Côte d'Or. It is a series of non-contiguous kind of broken up vineyards that do cover the hillside. The hillsides are lower. They have more gentle slopes than most of the Côte d'Or, except when you really get towards the top. The soil, because it is an extension, they really do share a lot in common with the Côte d'Or too. You have a lot of weathered limestone, clay, marl, just like the Côte d'Or. The Chardonnay grapes within the Côte Chalonnaise do prefer more of the kind of like clay and marl soils, where the Pinot Noir does prefer the limestone soils. Now you would expect that being further south in France, that the Côte Chalonnaise should be warmer than the Côte d'Or. That would be correct to expect that, just based on what we know about climate as we move closer to the Mediterranean. But the truth is that the area is actually cooler. It is less protected from the hills, by the hillside from the wind. It's more exposed, and because of this, because of this, the grapes in the Côte Chalonnaise are always picked later than the grape in the Côte d'Or. It's the smallest, as we saw on the map, of Burgundy's 4 main areas. What are the 5 main village AOPs? Bouzeron, Rill, Mercurey, Givry, and Montagny. We have other appellations that you might see coming from the region. So Bourgogne, Côte Chalonnaise, this is your regional appellation, sort of like just like Burgundy or Bourgogne in general. But this is actually more specific. So a lot of people consider that the Bourgogne Côte Chalonnaise is actually a superior appellation to just Bourgogne, because again, grapes for Bourgogne level wines can come from anywhere, all the way from Chablis to Beaujolais and anywhere in between, right? So all of the grapes for Bourgogne Côte Chalonnaise do have to come from this area that covers these 44 communes. The wines can be white, rosé, or red. You also see Bourgogne Côte du Cruchois, which is this small area. It's just south of the village of Morange in the Côte de Beaune in the Côte d'Or. So it's kind of an extension of a similar wine style that you see in Morange, which is a little bit more of a rustic style of Pinot Noir. But unfortunately, the Cruchois does not have a lot planted there anymore. It's only allowed for Pinot Noir. And the last statistics show that only 12 hectares were declared the last year that the statistics were available for Cruchois. So not something that you'll probably see, but if you happen to find that out and about, maybe pick it up, see what it's like. The wines are inexpensive. They are a little bit more of this rustic style of Pinot Noir. Also, the Côte Chalonnaise is the center of Cremant, so sparkling wine made like Champagne, outside of Champagne, but still in France. And then, of course, we have our 5 village appellations. The region was heavily impeded by phylloxera because the region has always been less dependent economically on vineyards, growing grapes, and making wine. Post phylloxera, there really wasn't enough incentive to replant many of the vineyards. There really wasn't enough of an economic need to do so. So Jasper Morris kind of described this as a region in need of a lasting revival, which I really hope that we're coming to soon, especially in the hands of so many capable and passionate producers who are really, really interested and capable of spreading the word of the Côte Chalonnaise and also the wines throughout other areas of the world, right? So we'll get those wines out there into the public. Global expansion of the Côte Chalonnaise in terms of sending its wines out for people to enjoy. Another thing that's really cool too is, so as we look through the maps that we have here, these are all maps that I found online. Some are better than others. There are a couple of great books for maps of Burgundy, and Sylvain Petiot, who is the kind of sort of like cartographer, map maker that makes one of the main books of maps for Burgundy wine called like I think it's called like the Climats of Burgundy. I'd have to look it up. I can't remember the exact name. I think it's the Climats of Burgundy. He recently published one on mapped for the Côte Chalonnaise. So if you are interested, that is available. And that just is really going to show that we are in the midst of this revival here, if it's important enough to publish its own book of maps about these Premier Cru and Village Liudis, right? Especially with the fact that when we think of the Côte d'Or, a lot of those villages that we're looking at are the classified, the top of the top, the Tête du Cuvée, the Grand Cru vineyards, right? All right, let's get into some of these vineyards. So the northernmost village in the Côte Chalonnaise is the village of Bouzeron. So this was the last village that was promoted to its full own AOC status. It didn't happen until 1998. There are 161 hectares of land that are permitted for Bouzeron AOC, but only 56 hectares are planted as of 2018. So not a lot. There is Pinot Noir and Chardonnay planted within Bouzeron, but you cannot release it as Bouzeron AOP because it's not Aligoté. So the Pinot Noir Chardonnay is released from this area as Bourgogne Côte Chalonnaise AOP. Producers like Aubert de Villaine do release wines this way. In Bouzeron, there's no Premier Cru classification. I have not seen if they're planning on coming up or not coming up with, but maybe moving the classification of some of its village vineyard to Premier Cru. Overall, the Côte Chalonnaise have too many Premier Cru vineyards. Maybe this is because of the fact that they don't have any Grand Cru, but Mercurey and Rouy aren't so bad. I have the numbers written down so I can remember. About 22% of the vineyard land in Mercurey is classified as Premier Cru. That's not too bad, 22%. About 24% in Rouy, but in Givry and Montagny, 45% of the vineyards are classified as Premier Cru and 58% of the vineyards in Montagny. So it is possible that to not dilute the reputation of the Premier Cru vineyards, maybe they won't upgrade any vineyard to Premier Cru in Bouzeron. Had yet to be seen. The yields in Bouzeron are lower than the yield permitted for Bourgogne Aligoté. They have north and northwestern facing hillsides that are planted entirely to the grape. The warmer and lower sites are usually planted to Chardonnay and Pinot Noir within Bouzeron as well. We see a lot of the white marl. The Aligoté does prefer that as well. The kind of like marly, like clay and limestone mixed soil. And there are two clones of Aligoté, Aubert de Villaine and Pierre de Benoist, who is his nephew and the winemaker for his estates. They really try to propagate the Aligoté Doré clone, as it is superior to the Aligoté Vert. This is one of those things, right, that you would never see from a bottle of wine in Burgundy. This is why we learn about wine, because you would understand that, wow, I had this A&P Villaine Bouzeron wine, Aligoté, and it was so lovely and aromatic, and it was textured, and it had depth to it, and it was interesting. And then maybe a week later, you tried a different Bouzeron from more of an unknown producer, and it was kind of thin and tart, and it didn't have the complexity and the weight to it that you got from the Villaine wine. Well, the difference in that could actually be the clone of Aligoté that they're ordering as well. So a couple of Liudis, I think it's worth mentioning in Bouzeron. Now, when it comes to talking about the Liudis and talking about the Premier Crus, we're not going to spend too much time. The reason being is because I'm not going to keep you here all night. I think there's like 53 or 54 slides to get through. We could be here till midnight, but I don't want to do that to you. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through the Liudis. As I mentioned earlier, this is more something that I wanted to put together for your reference later on, as now you have your foundation after this class to explore the Côte Chalonnaise more. So Les Clous, Dijon, and La Fortune are the three kind of top Liudis that you might see. These are village level classified vineyards within Bouzeron. Villain makes wine from all three of these. He makes great Le Clos from Aligoté, but also he makes a Bourgogne Côte Chalonnaise Chardonnay called Le Clos Ami, coming from Chardonnay on the lower slope of Le Clos. He also makes two red wines that are also classified as Bourgogne Rouge Côte Chalonnaise, the La Dijon and the La Fortune. So we have Le Clos, La Dijon, and La Fortune up here in the more northern side of the village. Aside from Domaine, Aubert and Pamela Villain, which is certainly not only the top estate of Bouzeron, but one of the top estates of the Côte Chalonnaise as well. And you could definitely say, we could argue for being one of the top estates in all of Burgundy, certainly. Some other producers you might look for are Temis. So Temis is the Greek goddess of divine justice. This producer is making 3 single vineyard wines, Le Clos, Le Cadeau, Le Corso. So this could be a really fun opportunity if you can source the 3 of these wines to try these different side by side. Maison Chanzy. So this is a really important negotiant, like a larger house. Initially, it was a Domaine Chanzy. It was set up in 1974. It sold in 98 and again in 2013. It expanded into the Côte d'Or, but it did pull back in the last decade to really focus. It sold those vineyards and pulled back to focus on vineyards in the Côte Chalonnaise, which I think will be a really great move for the estate. Sometimes Burgundy estates, maybe like Jacques Prieur, which is a great estate, but some of their bottlings are better than others because just based on the proximity of where they are to the vineyard and how well they can control it, right? So Chanzy has 66 hectares of vines. 85% of what they do make is estate made. So they own 85% of the vineyards that they make wine from. But this is a really fantastic estate to look for because they are well represented and you can find a lot of wine. So not only can you find the Bouzeron, but they're also represented in Mercurey, Rill, and Givry as well. Another producer aside from Villain that you might look for the Bouzeron is Sylvain Pataille. Something really fun that's kind of happening in the Côte d'Or that we do have producers focusing on Aligoté, right? So you have a lot of Côte Nuit and Côte Bonne producers who I think, frankly, this is my opinion, but I think that the story is I think they're tired of how expensive their wines are because so often these wines become so exorbitantly expensive on the secondary market. And that's because there's so little of it made. A lot of it's already allocated to certain, they don't really have like wine clubs, but more to importers or distributors who have been buying their wine for a long time. And so usually they get the bulk of the first pick of any of the wines, right? And they become very expensive once these middlemen go to sell the wine. Then I think my opinion is that the producers of the Côte d'Or are tired at how expensive their wines are. So a lot of them are making some of these less expensive styles of wine, which give you sort of an introduction to the estate at a fraction of the price. So Aligoté is one of the ways that a lot of these domains are doing this. Another would be Pas to Ground. Pas to Ground is the Bourgogne term for a wine that's a blend of Pinot Noir and Gamay, usually 2/3 Pinot, about 1/3 Gamay. This is also something that you can make out of the Côte Chalonnaise, and it can be used for the Bourgogne Pas to Ground appellation, which is its own AOP too. So a lot of producers in the Côte d'Or are making Bourgogne Aligoté, but there is one producer, his name is Sylvain Pataille. He's located in Marcenay in the northern part of the Côte Nuit, and he is an Aligoté specialist. In the Côte Nuit, he's making a lot of different single Liu-D Aligotés coming out of Marcenay, and he actually is also making his own Bouzeron. So another producer from the Côte Nuit that you can try in Bouzeron. And then Villain, we have to talk about these wines. They are easier to find in the market. We just got an allocation at Cork Buzz at Union Square, so I'll give you a little hint on that. We have a full case of the Aligoté Bouzeron. It's the 2021, I believe, and then we got like 3 bottles of the Ruy Les Clos Premier Cru. I think that one was 2019. I'd have to double check. So, you know, they makes a somewhat substantial amount of the wine, but in places like New York, because they're so popular, they do get snapped up pretty quickly. But these are not that expensive. This is a great Burgundy to try. The entry-level Bouzeron is usually around like $30–$35 in a wine shop. So they're really great introductory types of wine into the Côte Chalonnaise from a fantastic producer. If you're not familiar with Aubert de Villaine, he is one of the most important winemakers in the world. He came home to Burgundy. He was living in the United States with his wife, Pamela, who's an American, to take charge as the director of Domaine de la Romanée-Conti in 1971. And he moved his home further south from Vaune-Romany to the village of Bouzeron. I've heard in the past that he was also the mayor of Bouzeron, although that's unsubstantiated. I don't know if that's true or not, but I have heard it. He started his own domain independent of DRC in Bouzeron, the AMP Villaine, and he added vineyards in Rill and Mercurey in the 1990s. Just like Domaine de la Romanée-Conti, they work on more of the natural side. They've been organic since 1997. They're working biodynamic today, not certified. Pierre de Benoit is the nephew of Aubert, and he's taken over the management of the domain since 2000. He's also the winemaker. He's really an interesting guy. He's very passionate about the Côte Chalonnaise, even though he's also making the wines at DRC, not just at the Bouzeron estate, but really passionate about the identity of the Côte Chalonnaise and Aligoté. He is very into the concept of biodynamics. And I read something really cool about, he talked about the influence of the moon on the marine terroir of Burgundy. And that's really something that kind of blew my mind, because Burgundy was at one point a shallow sea. So Pierre is essentially believes that the moon does actually have an effect on the stones in the vineyards of Burgundy, and not just on the stones in the vineyard, but also the stones that they use to build the walls for the clos. So it might be something worth looking into. They have, in Ruy, they have plots of land in several of the Premier Cru vineyards, Grésiny, Montpellier, Margaux, Rabourcé, Reclos, Le Clou, Le Champ Clou. Le Clou is the one that we have at Cork Buzz right now. And then they also make wine under the AMP Villaine label in Saint-Aubin, Bouzeron. They have their Bourgogne Blanc, Les Clos Amis that we mentioned, wine in Mercurey, Bourgogne Rouge, Côte Chalonnaise, the 2 single Liud in Bouzeron for red, the La Dijon and La Fortune. All right, on to Ruy. I'm sorry to go so fast, but I know we just really have to get through this tonight. So moving just slightly further south, the AOC of Ruy includes both the communes of Ruy and Cheny. Earned its appellation status early on in 1939. It's a very large area. 109 of its 460 hectares are classified as Premier Cru. So again, that's 24% that we mentioned earlier. 2/3 of the production is white. The white wines of Ruy are light and fresh. They're very friendly. They should be consumed typically within 3 to 4 years of the vintage date. That outside of the best producers, of course. Villaine Les Clos can definitely hold on for longer than that. I would say probably 10 decades, if not more, depending on how it's stored and the conditions of the vintage. The best white wine vineyards face south and southeast. The northern end of the white vineyard make denser wines. They tend to be on the richer side with less minerality. And the southern end has more tension and more minerality. There are red wines produced, although it's a smaller percentage. They're also light, they're more perfumed, they have less tannic structure than either Givry or Mercurey. They should be also consumed on the younger, fresher side as well. And this is true for most of the Côte Chalonnaise, that the red vineyards tend to be situated on the lower slopes, not just in Rouy as I have here, but that is true for most of the villages in the Côte Chalonnaise. The reason is because you have more erosion, you have more clay, you have deeper deposits at the bottom parts of the slope, and you tend to have more erosion, more stone, more limestone, more erosion and more stones at the top of the slope tend to be a little bit better for Chardonnay in this area. We mentioned before for Cremant de Bourgogne, this is the center of the sparkling wine industry, not just for Cremant for Côte Chalonnaise, but if it's released as Cremant de Bourgogne, most of the time, a lot of the grapes or the wines are coming from the village of Rouy itself. As we go through some of these Premier Crus, since there are so many to discuss, I'll only kind of stop on a couple that might deserve a little bit of mentioning as we kind of move through the Premier Crus, but I'll let you look at a lot of them yourself. So I think the Clos du Chania, and then also the next Premier Cru, the Clos Saint-Jacques, not to be confused with Clos Saint-Jacques in the Côte d'Or and Givry Chambertin, but these are both monopoles of Domaine de la Folie. They're up here in the village of Chany. They are both old vine cuvées. Chardonnay is 60 plus years old and Clos Saint-Jacques is 80 plus years old. They'd have a lot of noticeable concentration and structure to the wine. Les Clos, I think is really fun. I think it's right here in the center. So Les Clos is primarily made by Rill Vincent de Rill Ganthiol. It's maybe not the primary producer, but I think one of the most important. He has a very small plot of Pinot Noir here that was planted in 1936 that he releases as Les Clos with an S. One of the confusing things about Burgundy is that some producers do spell the same vineyard slightly different, which is kind of unfortunate, but also don't forget, we'll mention this later on, a lot of these villages also have vineyards that are partially classified as Premier Cru and village level. We'll get a little bit into that in a little bit as well. Marceau, Les Mets Cadeaux. Les Mets Cadeaux is a pretty substantial size Premier Cru just east of the village. They are considered to make very exceptional wines, but it's thought that that's probably just due a lot, in fact, to the producer itself. So in this case, Vincent de Rill Ganthiol does dominate a lot of the planting within Les Mets Cadeaux, and he has two separate bottlings of 1980 and 1920 plantings within the region. Montpellier is a steeper vineyard, a lot of erosion, and it has a higher proportion of Chardonnay Musqué. Chardonnay Musqué is a clone of Chardonnay that, as you can imagine, if you've studied wine at all or been in these classes, Musqué, I would always think like compare that, something like Muscat, something like that. It is a more floral aromatic clone of Chardonnay. Does that make it as aromatic or as floral as something like Muscat? It does not, but by comparison, in the context of the neutrality of Chardonnay, it does have more florality and more aromatics to it as well. Pilot, the monopole of Montpellier. They do a single bottling of the oldest vine planted in 1920. The younger vines within the vineyard, they sell off. Let's see, what else are the fun ones to talk about here? So Les Renard, very, very, very tiny vineyard. It used to be a monopole of Anne and Jean-Francois Delorme. It's entirely planted to Pinot Noir, but at this time, nobody is making it as far as we can tell in the market. And I just wanted to touch on this for a moment because we are in Burgundy. The vineyards can change hand in terms of who their owners are. So just because a vineyard was made by one producer in the past doesn't mean that it will always be made by that producer, or new producers might choose to work the land, buy the grapes as a mini or a larger negociant and make a bottling under those wines, or they might outright purchase new plots of land within these vineyards, which then gives them the right to sell that wine under their own label with the name of that vineyard, whether it be a Premier Cru or a village lieu-dit. And oftentimes you'll see some of the, as we go through this, some of these Premier Crus might not have any names or information attached to them. Sometimes that's because there's nobody actually making a single vineyard wine from that particular Premier Cru. Does that mean that grapes aren't being grown and wine not being made? It doesn't. What it actually means is that the producers who do have vines within those lieu-dits or those Premier Crus are choosing not to bottle them as their own wine. So they could be blending them with other Premier Crus within Rouy or the associated village and be labeling that as a Rouy or a Montagny or a Mercurey Premier Cru. Don't forget that you can do that in all of Burgundy. You can blend Premier Crus of a single village and call it a Rouy Premier Cru, absent of a single vineyard name, right? In the Côte d'Or, you cannot do that with Grand Crus. Grand Crus always have to be grapes from a single vineyard, and you have to list the name of the vineyard on the bottle. Premier Cru can be a single vineyard with the name of the vineyard and the village listed, or it can be a village Premier Cru that's a blend of the Premier Cru vineyards associated with that village. I know we repeat ourselves a lot, but sometimes when you're saying village, village, vineyard, you know, it really helps to be as clear as you possibly can about this, right? We do have some lieu-dits that you will see on some bottles within the village of Rouy as well. There's a couple different groupings. We have a group at the top of the plateau above Agnew. So Rill in Rosy, Chatelaine, Caillou, and Inthiveau. Champs-Labaye is so this is really cool. So Caillou, Champs-Labaye, Pierre-Yves Colline Moret are both producers that are making wine out of this area. They're not based in the Côte Chalonnaise, but PYCM, Pierre-Yves Colline Moret, does make a couple of wines coming out of the Côte Chalonnaise. So another great opportunity to see Premier Cru wine from a really top Côte d'Or producer. We have a group of lieu-dits for the village that are on the flatter land, just southeast of Rouy, Bergerie Le Chaume, and then between Rouy and Chany, we have Les Saint-Jacques, not the same as Clos Saint-Jacques, another one, and La Folie. La Folie is a village-level monopole of Domaine des Folies. They make Chardonnay as La Folie, and they make the Aligoté as Bourgogne Aligoté. Any questions, guys? All right, cool. Let's go back one. So who should we look for in Rouy? One of the reasons I really wanted to focus on discussing a lot of these producers is because I want you not to walk away from this, you know, hour remembering everything that we learned. But again, it's just having a little bit of that knowledge in the back of your head, being like, especially these are not wines that you're going to walk to your wine shop and you're going to be like, oh, I want to try the Vincent de Rill Genthial, and I want to have the, you know, Maison Chanzy, and I want to have the Villain. They're not going to be able to easily source these wines from one shop. So I think it's more advantageous to, in your mind, remember a few of these producers that you're really curious about. And when you're at a restaurant or when you are at a wine shop or you're shopping for wine online, to then pull that out of your memory, right? And I do that all the time. I read about producers I'm interested in learning about and that I want to taste. And then I happen to be at a wine shop or I happen to be at a restaurant. And I'm like, oh, I remember hearing about this producer. Let's try this wine. So that's a really fun experience. So Domaine Belleville, an important larger estate, pretty easy to find wines coming from Rouy. They have several Premier Crus. They make a few Rouy village wines, Saint-Jacques, Le Cri, Villerange. They also make some wine coming from Mercurey. Don't forget that just because producers are based in one village does not mean that they only make wine from that village in Burgundy. A lot of producers own plots of land in vineyards in villages outside of where the actual winery is. So, and in this case, Belleville also makes wine in Pouligny, they make wine in Saint-Denis, and they make wine in Chambol and Givry as well. Domaine Bridé, small estate started with 6 hectares of vine, up to 15 hectares. Their son Stéphane and his wife Sandrine make the wine today. Jean-Yves Devivet, he actually, I think, is a fun producer to talk about. He became interested in wine working for Becky Wasserman, who was an American-born wine importer who really helped put a lot of these smaller producers that we know and love today, and are the reasons that Burgundy is so expensive, out into the market, especially for Americans. Vincent de Rill Genthial, I think this is really a person that, aside from Villain, Vincent is considered to be Roux's top producer, but I think also one of the top producers of the Côte Chalonnaise at this time. So whenever you see these wines, again, they're like pretty widely available. I mean, you can find these Premier Cru wine for, probably around $50 in your wine shop, depending on what Premier Cru we're looking at. But by comparison to the Côte d'Or, the quality is the same, but the price is much cheaper for you. So, we think about the Côte d'Or, a lot of just entry-level Bourgogne or village wines would be $50 in a wine shop. You wouldn't necessarily get the terroir specificity of a Premier Cru. Domaine de la Folie, we mentioned they have that monopole village level vineyard located in Rouy. P&M Jacquesson, the 3rd generation, Marie and Pierre, they took over from their father Paul. Jaeger Defoe, this is one of the wines. If you ordered wines coming from Le Dues with us, you got the Jaeger Defoe. I think it's the 2019 Rouy Rouge wine. I'll send out information on those later, since I forgot to upload those slides to the screen here. And then Claudie Jobard, she has a really long history with wine in Rouy. Her father's family had been nurserymen for vines for more than 60 years in a neighboring village. And her mother, Laurence, is an enologist who worked with Joseph Druhin in the past. She's also the enologist for Remossenet in Beaune, making some Rouy and then Beaune wines as well. Jean-Baptiste Ponceau and Albert Souni. Albert Souni is a fun one to think about because he also makes really excellent Cremant de Bourgogne. So, not all of the producers that make Cremant de Bourgogne, of course, are based in Rouy, but that's definitely an important one to think about. And I tried to, as well, put some of these labels, and sometimes, again, these labels do change, they update them, they become a little bit more modern over time. But I do try to put labels for you to just have that context of recognition as well. Moving on to Mercurey, named for a Roman temple dedicated to the god of trade and commerce. Mercurey was a thriving center on the Roman road, had a long reputation for its wines. Oftentimes you'll see reference to the Chanty flute, which is a pipette that's used in the cellars of Mercurey to test the wine out of the barrel. It's called that because of its similar shape to the flute, which was an instrument invented by the god Mercury. We have 792 hectares of vines, vines within Mercurey. 178 hectares are classified as Premier Cru, and several different groupings around the village. So that's about 22%. It's 85% is red wine. There's a lot of fault lines, small hillsides. They're oriented in different directions, so this does help break up the wind. There's a special area known as Le Crescent d'Or, the golden croissant, essentially, or the golden crescent, where we have east, south, and southwest facing vineyards just outside the village. It's great, like Premier Cru slope, essentially. The delimitation of Mercurey, because of its reputation and its history, began in 1919. As early as 1923, legislation restricted its neighboring villages of Givry and Rouy from labeling their wines as Mercurey, because the wines of Mercurey were already so famous. And the appellation, the AOC for the village, was established in 1936, so one of the first. In 1943, the first 5 of its Premier Crus was lifted out of the group of just village level lieux-dits, right? So Clos Marcelly, Voyenne, Clos du Roy, Clos des Fourneaux and Montagny were all designated in 1943, with another cluster added in 1988. They've done a lot with the vineyards of Mercurey. So there was a lot of expansion in the 50s. They brought bulldozers in to kind of soften the contours of the land for a lot of places that had like kind of newly granted right to plant. But a lot of severe storms in the 1980s because of the changes that they had made to the actual surface. A lot of storms in the 1980s really ruined a lot of the land. So they started a major project in the 80s to build the drainage system. And you see this network of drains in the village of Mercurey today if you go there. So they actually do two things. They help drain a lot of this water, but they also collect a lot of eroded topsoil that actually return to the vineyard. That's not that uncommon in Burgundy or in places that are really steep. Germany, right, the Mosel, to actually pick up the rocks that have eroded to the bottom and replace them at the top of the vineyard. These reds are the deepest, the firmest, the richest of the Côte Chalonnaise. They oftentimes, along with the reds of Givry, really can go anywhere between like 4 and 8 years before they're ready to drink. The reds are considered to be better than the whites. The whites are a little less fruity than some of the other villages like Givry or Ruy. The whites are usually produced higher up on the slopes, the red towards the bottom. And Domaine Favely is important here. They own more than 30 hectares, including the Premier Cru monopole of Clos Maiglans. What are some other Premier Crus that we might look at in Mercurey? A lot to talk about. So we'll just mention maybe a couple of ones that bring some particular interest. Les Champs Martin is historically one of the most noted vineyards within the village. 20% of the wine is white from the upper part of the vineyard. Bruno Lorenzon, who we'll talk about soon, Chamery, and Thurlot Gillot make wine from the Les Champs Martin. What are some other fun ones? So the Clos du Chateau de Montagny, built in 950, it's owned by the Charmaine family, an important family for wine production within the Côte Chalonnaise. The vineyard itself is a monopole of Dumeix-Foulet. So the chateau, is owned by the Charmaine family. The vineyard is a monopole of Domaine Dumeix-Foulet. Dewey de Launay, the winemaker for Meix-Foulet, he's called this vineyard Enfant Terrible, because it is terrible in its youth. The wines are very finesse, but the tannins are so firm and it has so much aging potential that it really needs that time in the bottle to allow the tannins to soften themselves. A couple of other fun ones to talk about. The Clos du Roy, you see it both ways spelled here. That's because producers do label it with both. It's just over 10 hectares, one of the original 5 Premier Cru sites that were decreed in 1943. Previously, it was owned by the Dukes of Burgundy and the Crown of France, split up between several producers today. Clos Tonnerre, it's a quasi-monopole of Michel Gillot. I just wanted to touch on this quickly too, because this was the information that I got from Jasper Morris, that it's a quasi-monopole. So sometimes with some of this information, you know, I thought like, what could technically make it a quasi-monopole? And just thinking about what we know about Burgundy, probably the fact that there are other producers who might own vines here, but don't actually make a Clos Tonnerre Premier Cru wine, right? They probably blend it into something else. Or one of the other reasons could be perhaps other producers are replanting. Maybe they didn't find the past few vintages to be good enough to produce wine under that name, right? So there are many reasons that producers might own vines within certain Premier Crus or Lieux-Dits, but still choose not to bottle under the name of that. And maybe sometimes it's like genuinely they don't have enough. Maybe it's like Michel Gillot owns almost, you know, out of 3 hectares, he owns like 2.98 hectares. And this other person is like, what am I going to do with these few rows of vines? Like sometimes it's just not worth commercially vinifying these wines and selling them at their own label. So something to keep in mind there as well. As we're moving on, Clos Fortoul, this is a monopole of a producer that we don't see as often, Bordeaux Montreux. The Les Greffiers, again, it's only Chardonnay, this particular vineyard. That's not because it's classified as only being able to produce it, but because of where the vineyard is and because of the soils, it's only planted to Chardonnay at this time, but there are no producers who currently make the vineyard Premier Cru under its own name. La Mission is the monopole of Chamaret. It's entirely Chardonnay on this milestone white subsoil as well. If you like a fleshier style, Les Nauguets is one of Mercurey's best vineyards. They have a kind of a deeper red clay soil. The wines are quite fleshy with a lot of fruit and tannin. We have 3 producers coming from the vineyard that make excellent styles of the wine. Les Saumons, they have Jeannot Boulanger. This is a really fun name. They're a larger producer, negociant and domain producer within Burgundy, but they make a lot of great wines, ranging all the way from, I don't think they have anything in Chablis, but all the way from the Côte Nuit down to the Côte Chalonnaise. So I do really think that they're a high quality producer if you do run into any of those wines as well. So many to talk about. Clos Rochette, a monopole of Domaine Favely. One of the things I like to mention about this Premier Cru, this Village Liudé, we're on the Village Liudé now, is that it is very Chablisian in style. There are a couple of producers that do choose, generally, like most producers, in Mercurey, you're going to see higher percentages of new oak than you'll see in somewhere like Rouy, where the a little bit, again, lighter, fresher styles of wine. Generally, in Mercurey and Givry, I would say most wines are vinified with some oak and some new oak, especially even if it's around maybe sometimes 15-20%. But you do find some producers who choose to make wine without oak at all. It's not as common, and none of the ones that we have listed here, probably some of the more entry-level, less expensive producers. Who are the producers of Mercurey? Chamaret is one of Mercurey's most important properties, and it's so Bertrand de Villard. You'll see the de Villard if you start doing your own research on the Côte Chalonnaise quite often. The de Villard family owns several different properties within the Côte Chalonnaise. They tend to purchase the property but keep the name of the chateau or the domain under its original name. But they do have under their own name a small negociant project known as de Villard Les Renards. And these are really reliable wines. So if you see, sometimes you might notice the de Villard name. So I wonder if they have it. They don't have it on the front of this label here. But sometimes you'll just notice on the back or the front label in small font, the name of the family that actually owns the estate, if it's not under their own name. So you might look for, if you see that de Villard on any bottling coming from the Côte Chalonnaise, they're probably going to be really reliable, well-made wines. They do a lot of single, high-quality single vineyard wines as well. Domaine Favely is the negociant that is also a domain based out of Neuilly-Saint-Georges in the Côte Nuit. They built a winery in Mercurey in 2013 after expanding into the Côte Chalonnaise in 1930s. It was the 4th generation, Georges Favely, who expanded into the Côte Chalonnaise. They used barrels from Neuilly-Saint-Georges from their domain property. All of the wines are made in 3-year-old barrels. They have Clos Magland, which is the, might actually have it here, the monopole, yep, listed over here. The village level Clos Rochette, which we mentioned, Clos Ron, Framboisière, yes, the raspberry. Mavarennes, and then they're also making wine in Givry, Rouy, and Bouzeron as well. Mix Foulot, we mentioned, they have a couple of monopole vineyards as well. They are very hand-picked, native yeast, long maturation in barrel, really carefully crafted and well-made wine. They tend to be very traditional wine with a lot of depth and structure and tannin. They're definitely wines that you want to sit on for a little while with bottle age, or if you do come across one that has, 6 to 8 years on it in the wine shop or in the restaurant, it's probably a pretty good option for the evening. Bruno Lorenzon, Michel Gillot and Bruno Lorenzon are complete opposites. but both really important winemakers within Mercurey. Julot has quite a few plots within the Premier Crus, as you can see here. They've lived in Mercurey since 1404. They have 32 hectares, so it's a great estate in Mercurey to look for in the market. They're going to have wine because they own more land and they make more wine out of it. So an important way to really get your hand on some of these producers. Bruno Lorenzon is kind of the opposite. He is intense in the cellar. He trained as an enologist and a tonnelier, making barrels before he started his domain in 1997. He had very labor intensive in the winery, excuse me, not in the winery, but in the vineyard. His density is intensely high in the vineyard, meaning how many vines he has planted. He doesn't like to de-leaf his vines. He has extremely low yield, under 35 hectoliters per hectare. I mean, that's Grand Cru Burgundy status in the Côte d'Or. Bruno said that his vineyard is so labor intensive that per hectare, it takes 800 hours to work a single hectare for the year within his vineyard plots. His winemaking is on the more mineral side, but they're on the more minimal side, but the reds are very, very dense. And the whites are described as brilliantly balanced, meaning almost kind of like the same way that you would describe like Montrachet, right? Or Grand Cru Chardonnay coming from Burgundy, where you have everything that you say about the wine is true for it. Because a lot of times you want to say things like, oh, it has minerality and tension, or it has fruit and depth, right? But the top white wines have both in the perfect balance, where you can describe all of these characters that we usually think of as good attributes to wine, right? Depending on what you're looking for at the moment. But Montrachet and the Bruno Lorenzon wines have both. You'll notice his labels because they always have this kind of square O on the last name that is colored in as well. Reculé, also 11th generation, making really great wine. Francois is the 11th generation, and he had done a lot of work to improve the quality of the vineyard and the winery. Domaine Chermain, also important. 7th generation here. The reds are destemmed, vinified in wood. They get a lot of punch downs. Not all of the red wines in the Côte Chalonnaise do, but they do like quite a bit of extraction here. So you'll notice that the Chermain wines are more tannic. They are more extracted than some of the other styles coming from the Côte Chalonnaise. Toupinier, Batista as well, Clos du Roy, Les Valais, Sazonnet, all Premier Crus to look for. Thilot Gillot split off from Michel Gillot 3 generations ago. It's run today by Natalie and Jean-Claude. And these are also very carefully made small production wine. Barrel fermented, about 20 to 30% new oak in both the whites and the reds. Coming to the village of Givry. We've got a little bit of time left, but not too much. I promise I won't keep you too far over tonight because we don't have quite as much more to talk about. Just the 2 villages that we'll discuss. So Givry was promoted in 1946. 178 hectares of its 393 hectares are classified as Premier Cru. It is 85% red wine. You will find people that will argue whether Givry or Mercurey produces the best red wine of the Côte Chalonnaise. The village of Givry does produce dense red wines like Mercurey, but they're on the more elegant side. They tend to be a little bit sleeker, more charming. Although they have a density and a power to them, they are not as tannic and not quite as austere as the wines of Mercurey. Prior to phylloxera, the wines of Givry were the most sought after from the Côte Chalonnaise. They've been mentioned in text as early as the 14th century. One of the things that Francois Lump says, who is one of the top producers of Givry, is that Givry had better plant material than Mercurey. And this is something that we didn't mention earlier, but the truth is that plant material matters, right? So oftentimes when these vineyards are being replanted. And in the Côte Chalonnaise, one of the things that a lot of the growers are doing is ripping out inferior vine material and replanting with better material. This is not necessarily always the best for a producer to do in the short term, because how are you going to make wine when you don't have any grapes, right? So it really takes a lot for a producer to consider that economic advantage of ripping out grapes that are already producing wine to replace them without an income from those grapes for a period of years to eventually have better quality. But a lot of the producers are doing this in the region. They're really taking that risk to not only increase their own reputation, but just the reputation of the Côte Chalonnaise. Okay, the whites can be like kind of on the nutty side, like a little bit of fruit to them, but like textured and nutty and really lovely as well. So what are a few of the premier crus that we can discuss in Givry? Not La Petite Berg. They don't have any single bottlings. It was added in 2010. They did have a group of premier crus, which I listed here, but I didn't mention. There was a cluster that was added in 2010, and that's a total of 38 premier crus. La Brûlée, part premier cru, part village, Liu-di. I said that I would touch on this earlier, and I'll touch on this now. This is also something that does happen in the Côte d'Or, where you do have vineyards where part of it is classified as premier cru and the other part is not. So how do you tell the difference? You have to see either the word premier cru spelled out on the bottle, or that symbol for premier cru, which is the number 1 ER cru. So if you're looking at something like La Brûlée and it does not say premier cru, that is not a premier cru wine. It is coming from the village classified level, classified side of that village, not from the premier cru side. So maybe this is one of those conversations around the Côte Chalonnaise premier cru classification system, is that there might be too many. One, because as I mentioned, sure, pick a few of these premier crus that you want to try, but I think the more important designation for me for understanding the Côte Chalonnaise is by producer right now, and looking for these producers and trying the wines that are coming from them. If you can go to Burgundy and you can get some of these single, vineyard premier cru wines from the same producers side by side, definitely do that. Come back and tell us how it all was. Les Champs Lalo, another that partially classified as Village, Liu-di, and Premier Cru. They have white and red. It's a really great source. A larger Premier Cru at over 8 hectares, so a nice one to find there as well. What else can we say? Clos du Cellier Amoines. This is also a larger Premier Cru, but Jasper Morris lists it as one of his favorites within the village of Givry. There's just a small slash that's classified as the village wine. It won't say Premier Cru on it. You do have the Cellier Amoines, which is also a producer that makes the wine out of this Premier Cru. Clos du Cellier Amoines, the Premier Cru, Cellier Amoines, the producer. Domaine Thenard, which we'll talk about, and Domaine Jablot. Jablot is considered to be one of the best producers of the village of Givry. And I just want to touch on this Domaine Steinmeier. This is a Premier Cru producer coming from the cooperative of this single vineyard Premier Cru. We'll talk about that in a moment as well. Francois Lump, as you can see, is well represented in many of these Premier Crus, considered to be, I think, one of the top producers of the village of Givry. We have Vincent Lump, the brother of Francois, making wine as well. And then let's see. So white only planted in Galifrez. Domaine Chaufflet, we'll talk about. Christophe Drain. I don't think I have any information about Christophe in our producer profile that we'll go through. La Matros, another of the Premier Crus that was promoted, just half of a hectare in 2010. Andre Delorme and Domaine Bouzeron are making wine or using the grapes actually for their village level wine, so declassifying those as well. Pied de Chaume from Maison Chanzy. La Pied de Clos is an interesting one to consider. I actually cannot find it on this map. I was looking for it earlier, but it's a village plot that was purchased by Francois Lump in 1991, and he really thought that the vineyard was special, so he actually applied after he purchased the land for the vineyard to be elevated to Premier Cru, essentially for promotion. He was denied by the INAO, but apparently the commission happened to come by the vineyard. Francois was there with a digger that day, and he was able to actually show the INAO staff member that had come by that the soil profile was consistent with the vineyards that were located upslope and that were already classified as Premier Cru. So he was actually able to submit and then eventually win Premier Cru classification for his 0.84 hectare piece of Les Pieds de Clos, which is a pretty fun story as well. So a few Lieux-Dits. As I mentioned before, many of the vineyards are classified as part Premier Cru, part village level. Make sure you check your labels. If it does not say Premier, if in Burgundy, if it doesn't say it, it isn't. And that's not actually true, right? Because we know that a lot of producers declassify, but as you're looking at the label, if it doesn't say it, it isn't. So I could be possibly declassified, but unless you know what the producer did with those grapes in that vintage that you're looking at in the bottle, if it's not classified, if it doesn't say it, then it's not. So a few of the more important Lieux-Dits that you might see that are classified at the village level: Champorreau, Tep de Chaunaise, a lot of producers, several producers like Domaine Ragot and Domaine Bouzeron. Domaine Bouzeron is also, they also make wine in Chablis, so you might have seen them before, but they really think that Tep de Chaunaise should be classified as a Premier Cru vineyard. Domaine de la Ferte makes wine out of Clos de Mortier. As we're looking at some of the Givry producers, Domaine Bouzeron, they also make really fantastic Chablis, Chardonnay, coming from the northern part of Burgundy. Domaine du Cellier Amoine that we mentioned before, Domaine Chaufflet, they make really sensual, very sturdy wine. Jonathan Bruneau is the winemaker today. He is the son of Denis Valdenaire. He's the son-in-law of Denis Valdenaire. Denis Valdenaire was the son-in-law of the original Chaufflet. And Domaine du Clos Salomon. Jasper Morris really mentioned Salomon as the Dugardin family as a really fantastic producer of wine. They do tend to be slightly more on the rustic side, but they've been the sole owner of Clos Salomon since 1558 of this single Premier Cru vineyard. So that's something kind of cool to consider. Domaine Jablot is considered to be one of the best. Juliette took over her portion of the vineyard from her father, but she's still working with her uncle, her father's brother, in the vineyard as well. If you prefer wines that are picked on the earlier side to represent that acidity, that freshness in the wine, the Jablot wines are really fantastic to look out for. Francois Lump, they took in 1977, so it's kind of an interesting story as well. He and his brother Vincent began planting land that belonged to their parents, who were not vignerons, to grapevines. Much of that land has since been classified as Premier Cru. The brothers split up in 91. So today you have Francois with his children, Pierre and Anne Cecile. And then Vincent Lump has his own domain, his brother. Today that's run by Vincent and his son Baptiste. He tends to use less wood than Francois, a little bit more reserved styles of wine, and he doesn't make quite as much wine as his brother Francois does. Domaine Mas vinifies a lot of Givry's Lieux-Dits. A lot of those were promoted in 2010 to Premier Cru. Domaine Ragot, Clos-Ju, Le Grand Berge, Creusot, those are definitely ones to look out for. Michel Sarrazin. So this is also something interesting I think is worth mentioning. If there's a lot of producers in the Côte Chalonnaise that actually think that machine picking is better for their grapes and for their region. One of the reasons is it's just a lot faster. You can pick the grape before it gets warm outside during the day and have them into the cellar. So there's a lot of producers that typically we like to think, you know, there's only one right way to make wine, which is hand harvesting and being as gentle as you can. But there's a lot of merit to everybody's opinion on how to make wine. And a lot of producers really do stand behind machine harvesting within the region. If you go somewhere like Chablis as well, in Chablis, most of the grapes, except in the Grand Crus, because they're too steep, are also hand harvested. Okay, last village. I hope you're still with me. We're going to wrap it up really shortly here. Montagny, bookended white wine village. Any reds that are grown within the village are sold as Bourgogne Rouge or Bourgogne Côte Chalonnaise Rouge. They can sell it as either. Based around 4 communes: Bouxy, Montagny-les-Bouxy, Saint-Valerin, and Julie-les-Bouxy. 240 hectares of its 415 hectares are classified as Premier Cru. This is a village that was not as prosperous as the other villages in the early 20th century. The plots were tiny. They were managed by small farmers. They would use milk cows because they didn't have horses to plow the land. It would primarily, at this time in the 20th century, planted, or 20th and 19th century, I believe, planted mostly to Gamay and Aligoté. But most of the vineyards fell into disuse after World War I. And when the economic crisis really caused, in the 20s and 30s, caused the cooperative to start up, like the Cave des Bouxy, which we'll talk about, that was founded in 1931. They really started replanting to Chardonnay. So the fame of the village began to develop after World War II. Most of the vines that were ripped out of the older Aligoté and Gamay were replanted with Chardonnay, again, classified only for Chardonnay today. And the Cave des Bouxy remains one of the most dynamic and respected co-ops of Burgundy today. So the village AOC was actually established, an interesting story, in 1936. And in 1943, all of the vineyards in Montagny were classified as Premier Cru. This was done because essentially the dividing line between occupied France and Vichy France sliced right through Montagny. And one of the ways that the local growers were able to preserve their vineyards from having to sell the wines or give the wines or the vineyard to occupied France, to German troops, was by classifying them as Premier Cru. There were laws protecting, of course they did that in the Côte d'Or, protecting vineyards that were classified as either Premier Cru or Grand Cru. And so they did this in Montagny. So in 1989, they extended the actual appellation boundaries of the AOC of Montagny, and they declassified and reduced quite a number of the Premier Crus to bring it more in line with the rest of Burgundy, although there are 49 Premier Crus today. But because not all of them really deserve to probably have Premier Cru status, and one of the reasons they probably didn't take away more of the Premier Crus in 1989 was because it's hard to tell somebody you're taking away their Premier Cru status. So there were a lot of vineyards that probably retained that status from them classifying all of the vineyards as Premier Cru in 1943 that shouldn't have. So you're in luck. We don't actually have a lot of Premier Cru vineyards to talk about in Montagny. In the north, they have a much stronger limestone character. You see more clay as you move further south. Montagny is really the only village that shares more in common in terms of its geology and its soil structure with the Mâcon than it actually does with the Côte d'Or. So you'll definitely be getting to see more clay in the soil as you're moving further south. So the Chardonnay is very distinct from the other white wines of the Côte Chalonnaise. It is lively and fresh. It has this beautiful, like they say, sort of almost marine character that does recall some more of the character of the Chardonnay coming from Chablis, although we definitely have more fruit and ripeness coming from further south. So there are essentially 3 groups of Premier Crus. You have one that sits in the north above Bouxy, but only one of those, which is Les Vieux Chateaux, is actually used or classified on any labels. Keep in mind, that doesn't mean that you will never see these. You might have one grower who one year decide to bottle it as a single vineyard and continue to do so, or doesn't do so the year after. A lot of producers use a lot of these Premier Crus as blends in their village Montagny Premier Cru. We have a group of Premier Crus between Bouzeron and Montagny, Les Bouzeron, that face primarily southwest. Les Combes at just about 2 hectares is an important one to discuss. They have a high proportion as well of that clone of Chardonnay Muscat that we talked about before. Cellier Amoine and Cognard bottle Les Combes as a single vineyard Premier Cru. Montcouchot, Mont-Laurent, Les Bonneveau, Les Bassets, Les Truffières, which does mean truffle field, and Les Bernines are all bottled as their own Premier Cru by different producers. Bruno Lorenzon said that the Truffière bottling from him is meant for early drinking. The plot from Stéphane Aladame. Stéphane Aladame is, I think, probably the top grower of Montagny. The plot of vines that he had within the 10 hectares of Les Bernines were planted in 1923. So it is really cool. You do have a lot of producers that are seeking out more of the old vine sections of some of these vineyards within Montagny and the Côte Chalonnaise as well. And then you have a third cluster of Premier Crus between Montagny, Saint Valerin, and Julie Les Bouzeron. These vineyards face more east and also a little bit northeast. So we have Les Perriers, we have Les Platiers, Marocs, Sous les Fouilles, and Saint Moril. To look for. This is a fun one because Philippe Colline is a producer based in Tressagnes-Montrachet. Philippe Colline also has a South African project for Chardonnay called Topiary. If you run into that in the store, Topiary, kind of like the, like tree bushes, topiary, like I guess you would call that, like topiary is like a manicured tree, right? That's what it means. So topiary, coming from South Africa, is also a project of Philippe Colline. The wines are really fantastic. In Saint Moril, you see an unoaked version of Chardonnay coming from the region. You also see in the same cluster of Premier Crus, La Vigne Derrière. This is the most austere of Aladame's Montagny wine. In Les Gourasses, Jean-Marc Pilot, another Tressagnes producer, is making a small bottling from 110-year-old vines in the region. You'll see Les Chanillot from Albert Souny. That's the producer we mentioned earlier, coming from Rouy, that also makes really fantastic Cremant de Bourgogne. Les Coeurs is the most bottled Montagny Premier Cru. So over 31 hectares, this is the largest. You're most likely to see this Premier Cru coming out of Montagny, just because simply there's more of it made. It's a plateau that's exposed to the east. It has clay, so it gives this full rounded style of Chardonnay. Filat Gilot, Albert Souny, Aladame, Domaine Pigneret, and the Cab des Bouzeron are all great producers to look for coming out of this spot. And Favelis bottled a small plot of the Premier Cru of Leila as well. Thank you guys for sticking with me. This is so fun. You understand why I don't want to talk about everything on these slides, right? I went a little overboard. I got a little bit too excited putting this together for you, but I'm really happy that you do have this resource to keep all of this information. So there's just a couple of producers to discuss. Many of them we talked about already. The Cab des Bouzeron. This is the cooperative founded in 1931. It represents 372 co-op members stretching over 1,100 hectares, all the way from Santenay to the Mâconnais. Santenay located in the Côte d'Or. They make 3 categories of wine. So Buissonnier, which is the regular range, you can see represented here. They make a range of single vineyard wines, and then they have some domain wines where they purchase the domain who own the vineyard. So we mentioned that earlier, Domaine Steinmeier and Labor Julot. Those are 2 wines to look for if they're estate owned by the Cab des Bouzeron, domain owned, that they make single vineyard Premier Cru wines out of. Berthenay, been here for 4 centuries. Another great source to look for within Montagny. And then the last two to mention, Laurent Cognard. Laurent took his family vineyard back from the Cave de Bouxy co-op in 2004. And this is a common story that you'll see where maybe people who inherit vineyard from their family but don't work in wine and don't want to actually work the vine will essentially lease their vine to the co-op or to one of the growers who will then put their grapes into the co-op wine. But then maybe you have another family member or a child who comes along and they want to carry on the family tradition of making wine. And so whenever that contract is up with the co-op, they'll take those vineyards back and begin farming them themselves. So that does give them the opportunity to then release the wines as a domain wine. So this is what Laurent Cognard did. He doesn't like to use very much new oak, larger barreled with very little oak, if any. And then we also have the Frilot Julot. Francoise bought out her partner in 2002, and she replanted any Pinot Noir and Gamay and Aligoté within Montagny in their vineyard with Chardonnay. Her daughter Camille had joined in since 2021. They make a couple of really fun old vines. So they have these two, I guess you would call them fantasy labels, which is the last thing I swear we're going to talk about. So you might see on some of these labels sort of a fantasy name coming from maybe like a Premier Cru vineyard. So Louis is a fantasy bottling of old vines. That's what VV means, VA Vine, coming from the Premier Cru Correa. And Victor is VV Old Vine, VA Vine, coming from Mont Cruchot. So if you're looking over this later and you're like, what do all of Amber's disjointed notes mean on these slides, please don't hesitate to reach out. Camille is a young vine Montagny wine that's produced, named for her daughter Camille, of course. So younger vines coming throughout the village that come into a single bottling with a fantasy name of Camille. That was fun, everyone. Thank you. I hope are you still here?
Yeah, hi. We actually have a quick question. What do you mean by the fantasy labeling, the fantasy wines?
Yes, so that just means essentially rather than labeling the wine with the name of the vineyard, that they come up with a fantasy name. So I took that term fantasy name from Super Tuscans. So a lot of Super Tuscans have fantasy names, La Pergola Torte, Fontaloro. Which could be, you know, like a lot of these Super Tuscans are all like Sole Olena. They're like fantasy names that a producer comes up with to represent their bottling, and they're not labeling it with the actual name of the place. So like naming this Montagny Chardonnay as Camille is essentially a fantasy name that she had come up with to represent the younger vine from the village. Did that make sense?
Yeah. So it's kind of more of like a new world way of labeling it.
Yeah.
like thinking of like American.
It actually kind of is. It's like rather than using the vineyard name itself, you're using a fantasy name, you know, and thankfully, because of I can barely even lift up this book. Thankfully, because I really is so heavy. I had it in my backpack today and I was like, oh my gosh, this is too heavy. But like thanks to people like, you know, Master Wine, Jasper Morris, who researches all of these things and like puts them into context for us. We know that Camille, that bottling is the younger vine from Montagny, so Chardonnay. Yeah. That's what that means. And we see, it's fun to see a little bit of that too. Because I think that also shows that the producers of the Côte Chalonnaise are recognizing, you know, we think of Burgundy as being so insular and in a way kind of set in its ways. And when you see the producers who are making styles of wine that are representative of what you're seeing other places in the world, I think that shows us that we're really moving in a wonderful direction in the Côte Chalonnaise.
Great, yeah.
Okay. I hope you're really excited to go out and try some wines.
Yeah.
All right, well, I'll send out a copy of this recording. I'll send out notes. There was a couple of typos in the slides. I'll correct those before I get you a copy. And if you have any questions, please let me know. I'll send out information on the wines from Ledoux as well when I send out the information tomorrow. Thanks,
Great.
everyone. Thanks for
Thank
speaking.
you. Thank you.
Nice to see you. Have a
Thanks.
great night. I'll see you soon.